Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So today I have the pleasure to be speaking with Stephanie, who I know from a community that we are both part of. I also had the pleasure of reading or starting to read her book, and which is on a specific form of grief, a topic that really interests me due to personal reasons. So today we're going to dive into this topic that is actually, I think, widely experienced, but not as widely spoken about or understood. Ambiguous grief. It stands for the grief that is experienced after the loss of a relationship with someone, but not through death. And so I can't wait to hear Stephanie telling us all that she's got to know since her own personal experience with ambiguous grief. So about this week's guest. Stephanie Sarazin is a writer, researcher, and ambiguous grief guide who aims to support those grieving the loss of a loved one who is still living, but no longer as they once were. Her work began with her own experience of midlife trauma, which sparked an ambitious journey spiritually and around the world to understand, name, and heal the grief she found within her. Her efforts reveal the first of its kind definition for ambiguous grief, whereby grief is the onset by the loss of a loved one who is still living, and wherein the experience of hope presents as the grieving process. She's the author of Soulbroken, a guide for your journey through ambiguous grief, which won the 2023 Nautilus Books Gold Award in the category of grief and loss. So welcome, Stephanie. It's so nice to have you here on the podcast.
Oh, hello, Nathalie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be with you today.
I'm really excited, and we spoke just before starting to record that realization that I had actually just most recently about my relationship to ambiguous grief. But first of all, why don't we start by asking you, given that what we're going to talk about today, how are you with that? How are you doing today?
Thank you for that question. How am I today? It is always a special time to be able to enter, a space with someone like yourself, a trauma-informed, grief educator who understands the space. I always feel grateful. And so that gratitude that I'm feeling sitting down with you is mixed, I'm sensing, with a little sadness, which is only coming up because you asked. Mm-hmm. And so thank you, because that allows me to be honest with myself. And that's okay. I'm not afraid of sadness. Just recognizing it gives me the opportunity to explore it a little deeper.
Thank you for sharing so openly about that. But why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about your story, how you encountered loss in your life, so that they get a picture of who you are and where you're at.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I work in the grief and loss space now, though that was never anything I aspired to be growing up. And, I've yet to meet a child who says that they want to work in grief when they're older, but, and that's okay. Grief is something that I came to know intimately about 8 years ago, when the marriage I loved and the relationship I had been in for 20 years was revealed to not be what I believed it to be. And this was a discovery on a regular Tuesday morning nothing extraordinary about the day, except my whole life changed in a matter of minutes in discovering that my marriage wasn't what I believed it to be. And after that initial discovery, I often say I felt like Alice being pushed down the rabbit hole, and just feeling a sense of fright and curiosity and fear, all sorts of different emotions and feelings coming up in the days and weeks after. Soon after we divorced, and I found myself, Nathalie, just in a space of absolute despair. The world didn't feel safe to me any longer. I didn't know, I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know if I could trust myself, which is really, one of the saddest things about betrayal, is that it really impacts the person who's betrayed in so many ways that really aren't realized immediately. It kind of comes in an unfolding, and recognizing that I had lost a sense of trust in others, in the world around me, and in myself, led me to just a really deep state of depression. I didn't tell my family or friends. I told a trusted friend and a therapist that I went out and found the day after. But these were the only two people who knew what had happened, because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how to make sense of this, and I didn't want anybody else to know until I could kind of get my footing. Later, I came to understand that that's very common. That if we experience an ambiguous grief where shame or embarrassment is internalized, the griever will often isolate and grieve alone. And it doesn't have to be that way, but I didn't learn that for quite some time. And as in the first 6 months after this discovery and then consequential divorce, I began to wonder how to feel better. How can I go forward? How can I live my life when I don't know what my life really was? And, again, in betrayal, it's one thing, we all know that we're going to die. This is no surprise to anybody. We are mortal beings. And so we understand that at some point our loved ones will no longer be with us physically. We will also die a physical death. And we know that is part of our future. But to not know your past is a whole different kind of discombobulating experience. It's okay that we don't know our future. We don't expect to, but we do expect to understand our most important relationships. We do expect to know the narrative of our past. And when that is called into question, it, again, very debilitating. So I really was trying to feel better. I was in a deep depression, and I just began getting curious. What can I do to feel better in a healthy way? How do I move forward? And I started asking just kind of questions of myself. What is this? This doesn't feel like grief I've experienced before, with deaths of my grandparents, say, and death of a friend. It felt different. And it was from that question that my work in the grief space began.
So, I have a little bit more information than the listener, because I started reading your book, and in the beginning of the book, you tell a little bit more of the background in terms of having been a family with 3 children, 20 years of marriage. And I don't know how much you actually now said, but to get the picture, I beautifully found that the comparison that you drew between that experience and you as a 6-year-old on a ride, I think it was, to be sort of as if the carpet was drawn underneath. And you explained it now beautifully as to, if you realize I didn't understand my past or what I have experienced as my safe haven before, when if you think about having a family for 20 years, your cues of safety come from that surrounding. So if a lot of that surrounding is not as you perceived it to be, and also understanding, okay, my nervous system had those cues of safety, but they are not safe, then it brings that, from a nervous system point of view, brings that whole system into question. And what do you do then? Right? So it makes a lot of sense looking at through the trauma lens of polyvagal theory. So an interesting thing you mentioned, I want to get into that. You said, I didn't tell anyone. And so for how long did you not tell anyone? And if you look back now with perspective, you mentioned shame and embarrassment. What made you think that if I open up about what would happen? What could be the worst thing that could happen if you did tell someone?
Yeah, so it was 3 months where only my one trusted friend and therapist knew. And looking back, I think I was in a protective state of my family, and I didn't understand it, Nathalie. It was surreal to believe that this was an active event happening to me. And I had all of this information that I didn't know how to process. And, it's chronic infidelity that I discovered. And so not knowing how to make sense of that and integrate it into the reality I was living, it was just something I couldn't do. And, of course, I later learned that a traumatic experience like that makes it almost impossible to integrate some things, in real time. And so I think I was just in protection mode of my family. I didn't want, I didn't want anyone to start to judge, or I certainly didn't want to be gossiped about. And that's the thing, the more and more I've talked to people who have experienced ambiguous grief, which can be activated by, a discovery such as mine, but it can also be a divorce or addiction, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, estrangement, incarceration, identity change. So many different things can activate this. And in these instances, as I've talked to people over the years, I've discovered that, I think that so often we don't talk about it because we don't want to be talked about.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And we don't talk about it because we don't want to be talked about. We're not safe. We don't know who is safe.
Yeah. And I think, because I shared with you before that I have a situation in my life where I just realized that what I'm experiencing with the loss of a relationship is ambiguous grief. And what I realized is that there is this thing about, what have I done wrong? What's that part about me? And because I can't find out, and I don't have that person's feedback, so there's no closure on that. It's also always the thing about, I think it depends on your personality, but mine is like, I'm taking it to me, I must have done something wrong. And then to not know makes it even harder. So, I mean, ambiguous grief has been around for quite some time, since Pauline, can't remember the last name, Paul, has coined the term. But maybe for people who don't know, maybe we start by explaining what it means. So you gave some examples already, and we explained it, but let's define it so people understand.
Yeah, and when I went in search of what is this grief, what is it, and how can I feel better? How can I heal? Those early questions that I had, it was really about how, if I could name it, I thought if I could know what this is, then I can figure out how to get through it. And my therapist, Amy, said, I was so desperately trying to intellectualize this, to understand it. but she knew all along it would be something I would have to feel. We can't think our way through grief,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so in my search, I came across Dr. Boss's work for the first time, and it was she had coined the term ambiguous loss. And at the time, her work was centered around she's a clinician, and in the 90s, she coined the term ambiguous loss based on observation of her patients, who many of whom were wives of soldiers who were missing in action. And she began to understand that when there is a loss that's experienced and it's unknown if there is a death or not, the grief is there. The grief, this loss is prevalent because the death is ambiguous. They don't know. And she said, this could be not just for soldiers who are missing in action, but for maybe there's a tsunami, a hurricane, there's a natural disaster, and loved ones have gone missing, and those living looking for the loved one is in this state of ambiguous loss, right? And I envision it as kind of a purgatory where you're holding vigil, waiting to see, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to let go of hope, and yet, we don't know. So kidnapping victims also leave families in ambiguous loss, and this was close, but not quite my experience, right? Because I knew that he wasn't dead. I knew there was no physical death, but there was a death of the relationship and a traumatic ending to the relationship, so that the person is still living, but our dynamic is gone. It is completely, irrevocably changed. And Dr. Boss did go on to expand her work to include a physical presence without a psychological presence. So Alzheimer's, dementia, traumatic brain injury, right? Where there's your person, but their injury has caused them to, be different in character or personality. They're no longer who they once were. So again, close, but not quite, because what I was really looking for was how to move through an experience like this with some tools, with some understanding of what it is and how we heal. And so I define ambiguous grief and the ambiguous grief process as the experience of grief that is onset by the loss of a loved one who is still living, but without societal norms such as funerals, the writing of an obituary, without these societal norms to engage, the grieving process is different. And the ambiguous grief process model is something I created, I co-authored with a therapist after presenting the idea, because it's something that she had seen time and time and time again, but again, didn't have a name, right? And so ambiguous grief, whether it's activated by estrangement or divorce or any of the myriad of other activating events, it has a pretty typical pattern that can lead to healing or not.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, two things I want to still talk to you about, is one of them is the hope, and I spoke to you about that before, and one is also the reference you made in terms of suicide. So let's talk first about the hope. So one of the things I mentioned in regards to my situation in my life is that I still hope for this relationship to not be non-existent. And yet I don't know. So why don't you talk a little bit about internal and external hope?
Thank you. Yes. And this was something that I found through my own internal curiosity and observation of others. And then it really presented in the data from the survey I had deployed, trying to kind of see if this hypothesis had any weight to it. So when you're grieving somebody, in your case, the estrangement, which it clearly is painful for you, Nathalie, and is confusing. And I appreciate you sharing it because it's so common. And yet, because we don't know really what to say about it, if the estrangement wasn't our choice, it's confusing, and we can spend a lot of time ruminating over what we've done or how we can fix it or what we need to do. But if the person won't talk to us, it leaves our hands tied, right? If we're the person who has elected the estrangement, chosen this for whatever reason, it is also difficult for that individual, depending on what the community knows or doesn't know, or what people believe, should be being done or not. But in any case, hope appears for ambiguous grievers. And this is what's unique about it, because when our loved one dies a physical death, when no matter what is brought on their death and they have died, we do not expect that they are going to ring our doorbell or send a text and say, "Hey, Nathalie, could we talk?" Mm-hmm. They're gone, right? Mm-hmm. And we can certainly hope, plan, be excited about seeing them in another lifetime, whatever your spiritual religious beliefs might be. But to hope that they're going to come back in their physical form and resume the relationship as it once was is not something we do. Ambiguous grievers do, because there is hope, because there is not a death. And as long as there is not a death, there is still time. There is still opportunity to heal that relationship, to understand, and to move forward together, right? To reunite. What I found, though, is that hope, while it is a good thing, and I hope that I say this in a way that doesn't offend others, because that is not my intention. I do understand that hope is a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. In Catholicism, hope is a virtue. We need hope through this human experience. It's hard. And yet, for ambiguous grievers, when hope is misdirected, it is as dangerous as it is good. And that is because hope, I like to say, hope acts as a double agent. Hope works for both sides. And by that, I mean, hope shows up in two different ways. Hope can be externally focused, right? And so external hope is when we are directing attention to the person we're grieving, because remember, they're still alive, and we're hoping to restore that relationship with them. Our behaviors are focused on helping them. Our behaviors are focused on, maybe if I just write the perfect apology, then the person who, has estranged from me will come back. Maybe if I find just the right prescription or the right medical treatment, my child who is addicted and on the streets will come home. It's hope that is focused on reuniting the relationship, and it's mostly on what can we do to fix that person to restore the relationship. Okay, you're nodding like can you feel that, right? And it's totally normal. And external hope, I should say, feels really good, because external hope is proactive, because we're in action mode to heal the relationship. But again, we're trying to heal the relationship by fixing a component of which we have no control. Yeah. So too much time in external hope is dangerous, because it can eventually lead to complicated grief disorder. It can lead to really just being stuck in quicksand, is how I like to describe it, where we are unable to move past this loss and integrate our grief. And we become fixated on the other person and just trying one more thing that can, get them back to who they once were. So external hope feels good, but we have to be careful, because it's a slippery slope. Mm-hmm. Now, internal hope, on the other hand, the other side of hope, is directed to the self. It's directed in the present, not the past. And it's focused with attention on our life as it is, not as we wish it to be, not as it once was. And so internal hope requires us to look inside and start to reimagine our life without that relationship, or without that person as they once were, right? And so that doesn't feel so good because the onus is on us. And it can often feel heavy, kind of like you're choosing to leave your loved one by the side of the road and move on. And that doesn't feel good because you care about that person, you care about that relationship, and you would like to not feel heavy, pervasive sadness all the time, and you'd like to heal that relationship. So internal hope can feel rocky and bumpy and hard in the beginning. And examples of internal hope would be focusing on a new hobby for yourself. It could be, engaging with your community. It could be revisiting something that calms and collects your nervous system. Puzzles are my favorite. And, any kind of artwork. And so internal hope and external hope is something that ambiguous grievers will cycle through. Both are completely normal, natural responses to the experience. And kind of, being on a roundabout, if you can envision that, just kind of going around and around, is quite common. The trick is, once you recognize the difference between the two, you can catch yourself and say, oh, wait a second here. I am working out of external hope. I'm going to stop what I'm doing. I'm going to stop researching the next treatment that would help or drafting this, perfect apology. And I'm going to focus on me. Let me do something good for myself. And that's how we slowly but surely, little by little, start to work toward what I first thought of as recovery.
Mm-hmm. So how did you, and assuming your children were with you, how did you as a family recover, or what resources helped you to deal with that grief?
Yeah, so this was really an interesting revelation, because what I found was a dearth of resources. People didn't seem to understand. And I hear from people over and over again who reach out and say, thank you for this book. Thank you. I heard you on this podcast, or I read this article, and you've described my experience that nobody else seems to understand unless they've had a similar experience.
Mm-hmm.
And because, we're not great at death in our world today. It's, again, it is a part of our human experience. And yet in so many cultures, we don't talk about it. We sanitize it. We don't really engage with others as active listeners, or as, in as supportive as we could be. It's kind of become a taboo topic in many cultures and many communities. And so if we can't do that kind of grief, which we know is coming and we're surrounded with, how can we show up for ourselves and others with ambiguous grief,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I suspect that's why there's just a dearth of information, because people aren't talking about it, or they haven't been talking about it. But in my research, Nathalie, I found that, given the, 8 to 10 activating events that seem to be consistent for ambiguous grievers, that equals, my calculations were that 94% of the population, of the adult population, will experience ambiguous grief at least once in their lifetime. And if we know that, then perhaps we can be better at building some resources to help. One thing that I found was helpful, again, I was looking for a book, a guide, something that would, I describe it as, kind of like having an older sibling give you their textbook before you take the class, that,
like a roadmap.
gives you, yes, that says like, here are the
a
things you need to
roadmap
know.
through Oz.
Yeah, exactly. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And while there were resources on grief and then resources on ambiguous loss, I was looking for a combination, the ambiguous grief experience. And what I found really helped me was, number one, finding others who had a loss similar to mine. Because ambiguous grief is so nuanced. Even, the estrangement component, if you are chosen or if you are on the receiving end of the choice, those are two very nuanced experiences, both rooted in estrangement, both activating ambiguous grief, because the person who has made the estrangement also feels ambiguous grief.
Yeah.
Because that's a loss for them too. So really finding somebody who understands and has the lived experience of your nuance is helpful. And the second was really borrowing from some other cultures that I discovered, and creating ritual and creating ceremony to honor the experience. I found myself in a really weird place of feeling almost envious of widows. I mean, even every time I say that, I'm embarrassed, and it's just true. I thought, and listen, to lose your spouse, it's horrible. It's heartbreaking. I've been a witness to this in my friendships. It is horrible. I wish it on nobody. And in my experience, watching a widow was something that I wanted for myself. I wanted to have the opportunity to express what my marriage meant to me. I wanted the opportunity to memorialize something I loved. And just because it ended traumatically, and just because it ended, didn't mean that it didn't deserve to be honored.
Yeah.
And so I decided to create a ceremony and go through the ritual of what I call a faux funeral. So the fake funeral, there's no body, and there's no physical death, but there is a relationship death. And so I invited my two closest friends, who knew my marriage most, kind of saw it up close. And I curated music. I read an obituary, and at the end, they spoke. And then at the end, I stood up to tell them thank you. And I received them as a widow would receive a line of mourners who said, "I'm so sorry for your loss, and I loved your marriage too." And that gave me, that was a turning point in my healing. And what I learned later, as I know you know, is that grief needs to be witnessed. We are not meant to love in isolation. We are not meant to grieve in isolation. And so when we can allow our community, our children, our friends to see our grief, then we can truly embrace this experience in a different way and move toward healing. And so my children saw me grieve. I did not hide it from them. I spoke to them about it. And I'm proud to say they understand that grief is the price we pay for love, and it is a price worth paying, because love is so incredibly just what it's all about, in my opinion.
So when you were sharing, I realized that one of the differences between a widow and you, maybe we would need a term for that, is that if someone has died and there's a widow, we are looking at that person and we don't necessarily have an opinion about his death. Let's call it a widow and her husband death. Now, in your case, I must assume that the people surrounding you, they might have had opinion towards what you've experienced, towards him, towards you. And then you are faced with people's opinion of, and then it's not about the marriage that you have lost, but about that person. And so that leads me to the question, in terms of people who have someone in their life who's experiencing, now it's your specific kind of loss in terms of the loss of a relationship after chronic infidelity as an example. What was helpful when people were with you or were asking you questions, and what questions were not really helpful in that sense?
That is such a smart question, Natalie. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's so insightful, number one. And that is not anything I've ever been asked. So thank you for that, your generosity there. You know, I didn't learn this right away, but I am now a firm champion of the idea that not everybody deserves your story. Not everybody has earned the right to your story.
Yeah.
And that isn't to say you're being judgmental towards somebody. It is that in healing, others' opinions aren't necessarily a necessary part of the equation, right? What matters is how you're embracing the experience, how you're moving through the experience or not. And so, I understand now in retrospect that I would have questions. And I'd like to think these are from well-meaning people, right? These are people I know in most cases. Certainly in some, curiously, it wasn't. But people want to know the details. Well, what exactly did you discover? Well, here's what I would do. And then it's digging for information. It's wanting more information, and then almost wanting that information to then posit and offer their suggestions that you've not asked for, right? And so I would say if you're, so two perspectives. If you are a loved one of somebody, if a loved one of yours is going through this experience of ambiguous grief and you're listening to us today and you think, oh, I didn't think of it that way. That must be what my friend or my family member might have experienced with their loss. Don't dig, don't ask for details unless they want to offer them. If they want to offer those details, listen and validate. It isn't listen and give your opinion unless it's asked for. It's really intentionally going in to witness the grief. And when they talk about what has happened, keeping in mind that if it's been a traumatic experience, they might verbally vomit all over you because they're still processing their trauma, and you might get more details than you wanted. In whatever case, it is a validation. That sounds so hard. I'm so sorry for this loss. I'm so sorry for your pain. And then I'm here if you'd like to share more. I'm here to listen and support as you need me. Okay. It's that. And then if you're somebody who has experienced the loss, I would say to understand that because not everybody has access to your story, kind of create, what I call a company line. Get your soundbite in order, ask a trusted friend or a therapist to help if you're not able to kind of put it together. But kind of, like a press secretary would say, thank you for your questions, but we're not taking any more questions today, right?
Yeah,
Thanks for being here. We're not taking any more questions. It can be, right? It's a healthy way for you to say, I'm not answering that. So something I would say that worked for me was to just say, thank you for your care. That's not something I want to talk about.
I think it's really important also for the nervous system, because if you think about the people's then comment to your answer, that goes into your story, and that doesn't necessarily make it better. Like if people have an opinion about your ex-husband, that doesn't make your situation better. Same as for a person who has a loved one who goes through Alzheimer's or dementia. The other person's opinion doesn't necessarily make it better unless, as you said, it's asked for, or, someone says, what do you think? What should I do? Then obviously it's called for.
Right.
But I mean, I say that with grief in general, if you can, I coined that the art of presence, be there and listen actively without needing to fix, fade, or offer suggestions or compare to something you've experienced or that your friend has experienced. That's the real art of being there for someone. And you offered some great verbalizations to that. I hear you. That must be really hard. Validating sounds simple, but is actually much more powerful than offering suggestions, I think.
I agree. And as I've heard you say, the offering your experience um, isn't always what they need to hear, right? So it's that art of the presence, and being there for the person. But in so many ways, I is it human biology? Is it societal? I'm not sure, but we try to relate to somebody. When somebody tells us something heavy, we try to relate by returning our heavy to them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. Like, you tell me about grief from estrangement, and I say, yeah, I had estrangement once too. And oh, my neighbor's sister is estranged from her sister, and this is what happened there. And all of a sudden, here you are in active grief, coming to share with your friend, and I've hijacked the conversation and made it about me and made it about somebody else. Now, my intention is to relate to you,
Yeah.
but the way I've done that, it does not serve our relationship or your grief. So, and it doesn't serve me because I've not listened. I've not learned to listen. And so I think, the art of presence is should be taught at an early age in all curriculum.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
I think you described that beautifully. It's about wanting to make same, like, okay, I feel you, but it's in a way, it's a question of timing as well. As you were saying, this person is in active grief, and the timing the intention is unintentionally painful, but it's also a question of timing, right? So, I mean, this has been really interesting. But the last question that I didn't ask, because in your book, somewhere along the line, you mentioned ambiguous grief in relation to suicide. And because I lost my mother from suicide, but as a reflection of her years of depression. So maybe we're not going to find a round end to this, because there would be more things that I would love to talk to you, but maybe in a second time. But if you would say something about what you discovered in relation to ambiguous grief and suicide, would you like to share that with me?
Well, I've not had that personal experience, and I'm sorry you've endured that. It is, from my observation, among the most painfully acute experiences a loved one can have, because it's almost it's a stronger, more robust version of ambiguous grief, perhaps, in that kind of the common denominator is this inability for reconciliation
and closure. Yeah, there's no answer usually, unless there's a letter or some explanation. It's like, why? There's never an answer to what happened actually and why.
Right. And so that's traumatic to try to make sense of that. And again, we have this idea of, we're born and we're children, and then we're adults, and we live in relationship, and then we die of old age, or we get sick and die, or we have an accident and we die. And this is kind of a linear, incorrect expectation of the human life cycle, right? And yet this is kind of what we hold on to. And so when something deviates from that, when the relationship is broken, painfully, when a person takes their relationship away intentionally, whether they take their life away physically, it leaves those present shattered in a different way, right? It is a nuance that, again, I suspect individuals who have experienced could name it far better than I could. But observing it is observing the grief of those being left by somebody who has died by suicide. Is, again, it's not well discussed. It's not well studied. And I think until we start talking about that and give it the attention it deserves, the people grieving that death are underserved.
Mm.
But it doesn't have to be that way. The more we talk about it, the more we can understand how to grieve and integrate our grief hopefully through that, we could live more fully.
I think you already gave one of the answers that usually people give in the rapid fire questions. So, and I think this is the purpose of these conversations on the podcast, is to have people understand and be better at their own grief with someone else who is grieving in all those different forms. So thank you so much for sharing your story and your way of what you have learned about ambiguous grief. Thank you so much. So I end with all my guests with a rapid fire question. Shall we do that now?
Okay, I'm ready. Yes.
Good. So grieving
I
and
feel
trauma.
nervous all of a sudden. Okay.
And you can answer just from the moment. Short answer is fine. Okay. Not a paragraph, just an end of a sentence. So grieving and trauma means?
Being offered a full human experience.
And healing means?
Integrating your loss, not just to recover, but to regenerate a new part of yourself.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of your specific loss and trauma?
I am able to access my emotions, my feelings easily. And I'm not afraid to do that.
And what would be one thing you wish people who are experiencing ambiguous grief and loss, what would you like them to know?
That they are not alone. They are not alone. This is a natural, normal response to loss. And grief is proportionate to love. So if you are grieving hard, that means you loved equally hard, and well done.
And the last one, what would be one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
It has been a portal to my highest self. And I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. It's been an honor to have you here as a guest. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Natalie, and thank you for the important work you're doing. It means a lot to a lot of people, including me. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on NathalieHimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep reading. I promise it will get easier.